I'm Marilyn Carter, a 65-year-old retired woman living in the dusty suburbs of Phoenix, Arizona. And if you saw me at the grocery store or walking my neighbor's dog, you'd think I was just another grandmother waiting out her golden years in peace. But the truth is, I've been living with a secret so dangerous and so valuable that it's kept me awake more nights than I can count. And that secret is currently sitting in an old jewelry box covered in dust in the corner of my garage, hidden among worthless trinkets and broken watches that nobody has touched in over a decade. My late husband, Jack, was a gemologist, one of the best in his field, and he spent 30 years of his life working with stones that most people only see in museums or on the necks of royalty. He traveled to South Africa, to Russia, to mines so deep underground that the air itself felt like it was pressing down on your chest, and he did all of this because he loved stones the way other men love cars, or sports, or money. But Jack wasn't greedy, he was passionate, and there's a difference that most people don't understand until it's too late. 3 months before he died of a sudden heart attack, he came home from what he said was his last consultation job, and I remember the way he looked that night, because it wasn't the usual exhaustion I was used to seeing after his trips. This was different. This was fear mixed with something else, something that looked almost like grief, and when he sat me down at our kitchen table and pulled a small black velvet pouch from his jacket pocket, I knew whatever was inside had changed something fundamental in him. "Marilyn," he said, and his hands were shaking as he opened the pouch and let a stone roll onto the table between us. "This is the Azure Tear, and it's one of only 3 blue diamonds ever found in the Cullinan mine in South Africa. And before you ask, yes, it's real, and yes, it's worth approximately $90 million. I stared at that stone, no bigger than my thumbnail, glowing with an inner light that seemed almost alive under our cheap kitchen fixture. And I couldn't speak, because my brain couldn't process what he was telling me. $90 million sitting on my kitchen table in my average middle-class home, next to the salt and pepper shakers I'd bought at Target. Jack continued talking, his voice low and urgent in a way that made my stomach clench with anxiety. And he told me that the stone had been entrusted to him by a collector who died suddenly, and that collector's family didn't know about the diamond because it had been acquired through channels that weren't exactly legal. And now Jack was stuck with it because returning it would raise questions he couldn't answer, and selling it would put us both in danger. "The people who want this stone don't send lawyers, Marilyn," he said, gripping my hands so tight it hurt. "They send men who make people disappear, and I need you to hide this somewhere so obscure, so ordinary, that even if someone tore this house apart board by board, they'd never think to look there." He made me promise that I wouldn't tell anyone. Not our son Daniel, not my sister, not even my priest. And he made me promise that if anything happened to him, I would sit on this secret until the world forgot the Azure Tear ever existed. 3 months later, Jack died in his sleep, a massive coronary that the doctors said he never felt, and I buried him with that promise burning in my chest like a second heart. I took that diamond and I put it in an old jewelry box that had belonged to my mother, a cheap wooden thing with a broken clasp that I'd kept only for sentimental reasons, and I filled that box with costume jewelry and broken chains and single earrings that had lost their partners, and I put that box on a shelf in the garage behind paint cans and Christmas decorations and boxes of Daniel's old-school papers that I couldn't bring myself to throw away. For 15 years, that diamond sat there. And for 15 years, I lived a quiet life of grocery shopping and book clubs and Sunday dinners with my son Daniel and his wife Samantha. And nobody knew that I was sitting on enough money to buy a small country. Daniel is my only child, and I love him with every fiber of my being, but I have to be honest about who he became because it matters to this story. He works in corporate finance, Something to do with mergers and acquisitions that he's tried to explain to me 100 times, but that still sounds like a foreign language. And he's good at it. So good that he makes more money than Jack and I ever dreamed of, and that money changed him in ways that broke my heart. He used to be a sweet boy who loved building things with his hands and reading adventure stories under his blankets with a flashlight. But somewhere along the way to success, he became someone who valued work over everything else, who checked his phone during dinner and took calls during his own father's funeral reception. And I watched this transformation with the helpless sadness of a mother who knows she's lost her child to something she can't fight. And then there's Samantha, my daughter-in-law, and I have to choose my words carefully here because she's still married to my son, and I still have to see her at holidays. But the truth is that Samantha is one of those people who believes that kindness is weakness, and that anyone who doesn't fight for every inch of space in this world deserves to be pushed aside. She came from money, real old money from somewhere back east, and she's never let anyone forget it. And from the moment Daniel brought her home 7 years ago, I could see the calculation in her eyes when she looked at me, like she was already planning how to minimize my presence in their lives. At first, it was small things, comments about how I dressed, or how I decorated my home, or how I pronounced certain words. Little cuts designed to make me feel small and out of place. And I tolerated it because I loved my son and I wanted him to be happy. But after Jack died, and Daniel suggested I move in with them because he was worried about me living alone, Samantha's true nature came out like a poison that had finally found a crack to seep through. Living with Daniel and Samantha was supposed to be temporary, just until I got my bearings after Jack's death and figured out what I wanted to do with the rest of my life. But temporary became 6 months, then a year, then 2 years, and with each passing month, Samantha's resentment grew more obvious and more cruel. She would make comments at dinner about how I was taking up the guest room that could be a home office, or how my old lady smell was getting into the furniture. And Daniel would either miss these comments entirely because he was staring at his phone, or he'd give me this apologetic look that said he heard it, but wasn't going to do anything about it. I started spending most of my time in my room or in the garage, trying to make myself as small and invisible as possible, because I knew that Samantha was looking for an excuse to force me out, and I wasn't ready to leave because I didn't know where I would go. The house I'd shared with Jack had been sold to pay off some debts, and my retirement income was enough to live on, but not enough to afford rent in Phoenix's increasingly expensive market. And the thought of ending up in some depressing senior apartment complex where I'd spend my days playing bingo and waiting to die made me feel like I was suffocating. But I had the diamond. I always had the diamond sitting in that garage among my forgotten things. And sometimes late at night when I couldn't sleep because I could hear Samantha and Daniel arguing about me through the walls, I would go out to the garage and just sit there with that jewelry box in my lap, not even opening it, just holding it and thinking about the life that diamond could buy me if I was brave enough to try to sell it. But I never did, because Jack's warning echoed in my head like a curse, and because I was afraid of what would happen if the wrong people found out I had it, and because some part of me, the part that still believed in promises and duty and love, couldn't bring myself to break the vow I'd made to my dying husband. So I suffered through Samantha's cruelty and Daniel's neglect, and I told myself that this was just how life was now, that I was old and obsolete and lucky to have a roof over my head, and I tried to make peace with the fact that I would probably die in that house, invisible and forgotten, with a fortune hidden in plain sight. Everything changed on a Tuesday in October, one of those perfect Arizona fall days when the heat finally breaks, and you remember why people moved to the desert in the first place. And Daniel had left the day before for a business trip to New York that was supposed to last a week. Samantha had been in a mood all morning, slamming cabinet doors and muttering under her breath about something. And I'd learned to recognize these moods as dangerous, so I stayed in my room and tried to read a book. But I couldn't concentrate because I had this feeling in my gut that something bad was coming. Around noon, I heard her footsteps coming down the hallway, sharp and purposeful, and when she threw open my door without knocking, I saw an expression on her face that I'd never seen before. Something beyond contempt or irritation, something that looked almost like rage. She stood there in the doorway, perfectly dressed as always, her blonde hair pulled back in a tight ponytail that made her face look severe, and she crossed her arms and said in a voice that was terrifyingly calm, "I've had enough of this, Marilyn. I've had enough of you and your junk and your sad little existence cluttering up my home." I opened my mouth to respond, to maybe apologize or ask what I'd done wrong, but she cut me off with a sharp gesture. "I don't want to hear it," she said, stepping into my room and looking around with disgust. "I don't want to hear your excuses or your sad stories about Jack or how hard your life has been, because frankly, I don't care anymore, and I'm done pretending that I do." She told me that she'd arranged for a junk removal company to come that afternoon, and that they were going to take everything I had stored in the garage, all those boxes and old furniture and forgotten belongings that I'd been meaning to sort through but never did. And she said it with such satisfaction, such obvious pleasure at my distress, that I finally understood that this wasn't about space or cleanliness or any of the reasons she'd been complaining about. This was about power, about putting me in my place, about showing me that she owned this space and I was only here by her grace, and that grace had just run out. "You can't do that," I said, finding my voice finally. "Those are my things, my memories. You have no right." But Samantha just laughed, actually laughed, and said that Daniel had given her permission to deal with the storage situation before he left, and that he'd probably be relieved to come home and find the garage finally clean. I knew this was a lie, or at least a manipulation, because Daniel wouldn't have explicitly told her to throw away all my belongings, but he also wouldn't have told her not to, because that would have required him to actually pay attention to what was happening in his own home, and Samantha knew this and was exploiting it. I tried to call Daniel, my hands shaking so badly I could barely dial, but it went straight to voicemail because he was probably in a meeting, and Samantha stood there watching me with that cruel little smile. And when I hung up, she said, "The truck will be here in an hour, and I suggest you stay in your room while they work, because I don't want any dramatic scenes." I spent that hour in a panic that I haven't felt since the day Jack died, my mind racing through everything I had stored in that garage, trying to remember where exactly I'd put that jewelry box, trying to calculate whether there was any way I could get to it before the junk removal people did. But I knew it was impossible, because Samantha had positioned herself in the living room where she could see both my bedroom door and the door to the garage, and she was watching me like a guard, making sure I didn't try to interfere with her plan. When the truck arrived, two large men with tattoos and tired expressions, I heard Samantha directing them in that bright, fake-friendly voice she used with service people, telling them to take everything, absolutely everything, from the garage, and to not bother asking her about specific items because it was all garbage. I stood at my bedroom window, watching through a crack in the curtains as they loaded box after box into their truck, and my heart was pounding so hard I thought I might actually have a heart attack right there. And part of me almost wished I would, because at least then I wouldn't have to face what was about to happen. I saw them carry out the box with my mother's old jewelry case, the one containing the Azure Tear. And I had to bite down on my fist to keep from screaming, because I knew that if I ran out there and tried to stop them, Samantha would know something was wrong. And the absolute last thing I could afford was for Samantha to become curious about why I was so desperate to save a box of apparent junk. So I stood there, frozen and helpless, watching $90 million get loaded onto a garbage truck, and I felt something inside me break in a way that I knew would never fully heal. The entire process took less than 2 hours, and when it was done, Samantha came to my room and knocked on the door with this satisfied expression on her face, and she said, "There, all done. The garage is finally clean and you can stop hoarding like some kind of crazy person." She actually used those words, crazy person, and I looked at her standing there in her expensive workout clothes that probably cost more than my entire wardrobe, and I felt something shift inside me. Some final thread of patience or forgiveness or family obligation finally snapped. I didn't yell at her or cry or give her any kind of reaction, because I'd learned over the years that Samantha fed on emotional responses like a vampire feeds on blood, and the best way to defeat her was to give her nothing. So I just looked at her with what I hoped was a blank expression and said very quietly, "Thank you for letting me know." And I watched confusion flicker across her face because she'd expected tears or anger or some kind of scene that would justify her cruelty in her own mind. When I didn't give her that satisfaction, she seemed almost disappointed, and she lingered in my doorway for a moment as if waiting for me to break down. But when I just turned away and sat on my bed, she finally left, and I heard her on the phone minutes later telling one of her friends about how she'd finally dealt with her mother-in-law's hoarding problem and laughing about my reaction. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I just lay in bed staring at the ceiling and trying to figure out what to do, because I knew that diamond was gone, probably already crushed in a landfill somewhere or buried under tons of actual garbage. And the thought of Jack's last gift to me, his final attempt to provide for me after his death, ending up in a dump because of Samantha's spite, was almost too painful to bear. But then something unexpected happened. Something that Jack used to call the universe's way of balancing the scales, and it started with a news report that came on the television the next morning while I was sitting in the living room and Samantha was in the kitchen making her green smoothie. The reporter, a young woman with perfect hair and a serious expression, was standing in front of what looked like a waste management facility, and she was saying something about an incredible discovery made by a worker at the Maricopa County Recycling Center. "What started as a routine day of sorting recyclables," she said, looking directly into the camera with barely contained excitement, "has turned into one of the most significant gemstone discoveries in Arizona history when worker Miguel Santos found what experts are now confirming is a rare blue diamond estimated to be worth tens of millions of dollars." I felt my entire body go numb, my coffee cup frozen halfway to my lips, and I couldn't breathe as they cut to footage of the recycling center, of workers in hard hats and safety vests, of police cars with their lights flashing. And then they showed it, a brief glimpse of a blue stone catching the light, my stone, the Azure Tear, sitting in an evidence bag on a table surrounded by officials in suits. The reporter continued talking, explaining that the diamond had been found in a jewelry box among items that had been brought to the center the previous day, and that police were now trying to trace the origin of the items to determine the rightful owner of the stone. She said that initial appraisals suggested the diamond could be worth anywhere from $50 to $90 million, depending on its exact specifications, and that it matched the description of a stone that had been reported missing from a private collection in South Africa over 15 years ago. I heard Samantha's smoothie blender turn off in the kitchen, and then I heard her footsteps coming into the living room, and she said, "Can you believe some idiot threw away a diamond worth millions? How stupid do you have to be to—" And then she stopped talking because she'd finally looked at the TV screen and then at my face, and I watched her expression change from amused superiority to confusion to slowly dawning horror as her brain made the connection that mine had made 30 seconds earlier. "That's not," she started, her voice higher than usual, her perfect composure finally cracking. "That couldn't be from, there's no way that was in your stuff, right? Because that would be insane. That would be absolutely insane. You didn't have anything valuable in those boxes. It was all junk. You said it was all junk." But I hadn't said that. She had said that. And we both knew it. And I watched her face go from pink to white as she realized what she'd done, what she'd thrown away, and the magnitude of her mistake began to sink into her privileged, entitled brain. The news report continued, showing footage of the worker who'd found the diamond, a middle-aged Latino man with kind eyes, who was telling reporters that he'd noticed something glowing in a box of old jewelry and had almost thrown it away before something told him to look closer. They were treating him like a hero, saying he'd turned in the diamond immediately instead of trying to keep it for himself, and the recycling center was giving him a reward, and the police were praising his honesty. And meanwhile, Samantha was standing in the living room looking like she might actually vomit right there on her pristine white carpet. "You need to tell me right now," she said, her voice shaking, her carefully maintained mask of superiority completely gone now. "You need to tell me if that diamond came from your boxes, because if it did, we need to call the police immediately and tell them it's ours." But I didn't say anything. I just kept watching the TV as they interviewed a gemologist who was explaining the rarity of blue diamonds and how this particular stone appeared to be of exceptional quality and historical significance. And I let the silence stretch out between us like a rope that was slowly tightening around Samantha's throat. She started pacing, her hands fluttering nervously. Her whole body language transformed from the confident, cruel woman who'd stood in my doorway yesterday to someone who was genuinely frightened, and she kept talking, her words coming faster and faster as panic set in. Okay, let's think about this logically," she said, more to herself than to me. "Even if it was in your stuff, we can still claim it, right? It's your property. It was thrown away by mistake. The police will give it back to us once we prove ownership." That's when I finally turned to look at her, really look at her. And I saw something I'd never seen before in all the years I'd known Samantha, which was genuine fear mixed with desperate greed. Because she'd just realized that she'd potentially thrown away a fortune, and her entire comfortable life was built on the foundation of money and status that this diamond could provide. "How would we prove ownership?" I asked quietly, keeping my voice level and calm, and I watched her face go through several expressions as she tried to think of an answer. "You must have paperwork," she said. "Documentation, a certificate, something that proves you owned a $90 million diamond, because people don't just have stones like that without documentation." But that was exactly the problem, wasn't it? Because Jack had specifically told me that this stone had been acquired through channels that left no paper trail, that there was no official record of him possessing it, that the entire point was for it to be untraceable. And now, that very feature that had kept us safe for 15 years was the thing that was going to make it impossible to claim. I explained this to Samantha, watching her face fall with each word, and I told her about Jack and his warning, and the collector who'd died, and the dangerous people who'd been looking for this stone. And with every sentence, I could see her deflating like a balloon losing air. "So you're telling me," she said, her voice barely a whisper now, "that you've been living in my house for 2 years with a $90 million diamond hidden in the garage, and you never thought to mention this to anyone?" I almost laughed at the way she phrased it, my house, as if her ownership of the space was the most important detail in this situation, but I held it in because I was starting to see a path forward, a way to turn this disaster into something that might actually work in my favor. "I was following my husband's instructions," I said. He told me the stone was dangerous and that I should never tell anyone about it. And I kept that promise. And now, because of your actions, that stone is gone, and there's no way to get it back without admitting to the police that we had possession of a stolen diamond. Samantha sank down onto the couch, her perfect posture finally collapsing, and she put her head in her hands, and I heard her make a sound that might have been a sob, or might have been just pure frustration. And for the first time since I'd met her, I saw her as what she really was, which was a scared, shallow woman who'd built her entire identity on money and status and was now facing the loss of both. "Daniel is going to kill me," she whispered. "When he finds out what I did, he's going to absolutely kill me." And there it was, the opening I'd been waiting for, because the truth was that Daniel loved his wife, but he also loved money. And when he found out that she'd thrown away $90 million out of spite toward his mother, I wasn't sure which love would win. Over the next few hours, as we watched the news coverage spread from local stations to national networks, as the story of the miracle diamond found in a recycling center became a feel-good human interest story that people across the country were sharing and commenting on, Samantha and I had the longest and most honest conversation we'd ever had, and it was born entirely out of her fear and desperation. She begged me not to tell Daniel about the diamond, at least not yet, because she wanted time to figure out if there was any way to claim it without revealing the questionable circumstances of how Jack had acquired it, and I let her beg for a while before I finally said that I would keep quiet on one condition. "I want you to treat me with basic human decency for as long as I live in this house," I said, looking her directly in the eyes. "No more comments about my age or my smell or how much space I take up. No more making me feel like I'm a burden or an inconvenience. And if you can't do that, then I will tell Daniel everything, including the fact that you threw away my belongings without his explicit permission and without giving me any chance to go through them first." I watched her face as she processed this, and I could see her weighing her options, trying to decide if her pride was worth the risk of Daniel finding out what she'd done. And finally, she nodded, a tight, angry nod that told me she hated every second of this, but knew she had no choice. But I wasn't done, because years of being small and quiet and invisible had taught me that when you finally get leverage over your oppressor, you use it. You push as hard as you can while they're weak, because they'll never be this vulnerable again. "And I want you to help me find a way to claim that diamond," I said, "because it belonged to my husband, and it belongs to me, and I deserve to have it, even if that means we have to get creative about how we go about getting it." This was the real test, the moment that would tell me whether Samantha was going to be my ally or my enemy in what was about to come, and I watched her face carefully as she thought about it. The greed won, as I knew it would, because Samantha was nothing if not predictable, and she finally said, "Okay, yes, we'll figure something out, but we have to be smart about this. We can't just walk into the police station and claim a stolen diamond without a plan." Over the next 24 hours, Samantha transformed from my tormentor into my reluctant partner, and we spent hours researching the legal implications of claiming found property, the history of the Azure Tear, the procedures the police would use to try to find the rightful owner, and anything else we could think of that might help us. The news reports continued to provide updates, each one more frustrating than the last, because they were treating the diamond like it was a miracle from heaven instead of my property that had been stolen by my daughter-in-law's spite. And they kept interviewing experts and officials and even the mayor, who declared that the diamond would be held by the city until its rightful owner could be determined, or until it was declared abandoned property and sold at auction. That last part caught both our attention, because we learned that if no one came forward to claim the diamond within 90 days, with proper documentation proving ownership, the city would auction it off and use the proceeds for public services, which meant we had 3 months to figure out how to prove I owned something that officially didn't exist. Samantha, I had to admit, was actually good at this kind of strategic thinking. when she wasn't using it to make my life miserable. And she came up with the idea of trying to find the original collector's family, the one Jack had mentioned, who didn't know about the diamond. Because if we could find them and get them to confirm that the stone had been in their family member's collection, that might be enough to establish a chain of ownership. The problem was that Jack had never told me the collector's name, only that he'd been from South Africa and had died suddenly, and trying to track down a dead South African diamond collector from 15 years ago with no name and no paper trail seemed like an impossible task. But Samantha was determined, driven by a mixture of greed and genuine fear of what would happen when Daniel got home and found out what she'd done. Daniel called that evening, his voice crackling over a bad international connection from whatever hotel he was staying at in New York, and Samantha answered with her usual practiced cheerfulness, telling him everything was fine at home and that she missed him and couldn't wait for him to get back. And I watched her lie with such ease that it made me wonder how many other things she'd lied to him about over the years. She didn't mention the garage or the diamond, or the fact that his mother was sitting across from her, looking like she'd aged 10 years in 2 days. And when Daniel asked to speak to me, she handed over the phone with a warning look that said, "Don't you dare tell him." And I took it and told my son that I was fine, that everything was fine, even though nothing was fine, and everything was falling apart in ways he couldn't begin to imagine. After the call ended, Samantha and I sat in silence for a long moment, and then she said something that surprised me, which was, "I'm sorry, for what I did. I was angry, and I wanted to hurt you, and I didn't think about the consequences, and I know that doesn't make it better. But I need you to know that I do actually feel bad about this." I wasn't sure if I believed her, wasn't sure if she was genuinely sorry, or just sorry that she'd gotten caught and that there were consequences for her actions, but I nodded anyway, because at this point, her feelings didn't really matter as much as finding a solution to the problem she'd created. We decided that our first step would be to contact the police as a concerned citizen who'd seen the news reports and thought she might have information about the diamond's origin. Not as someone claiming to own it, but as someone who wanted to help solve the mystery. And Samantha insisted on being the one to make the call, because she said she was better at sounding convincing, which was probably true, given how well she'd been lying to Daniel for years. She called the non-emergency number the next morning and got transferred 3 times before finally reaching a detective named Sarah Chen who was handling the diamond case, and I listened on speakerphone as Samantha explained that her mother-in-law's late husband had been a gemologist who'd worked with rare stones, and that it was possible he'd had contact with the diamond at some point in his career. Detective Chen sounded interested but cautious, asking questions about Jack's credentials and where he'd worked, and whether we had any documentation connecting him to the Azure Tear specifically, and Samantha danced around these questions beautifully, giving just enough information to seem helpful without committing to anything that could be proven false. The detective said she'd look into Jack's background and see if there were any connections to the diamond's history, and she asked if we'd be willing to come to the station to give a formal statement, and Samantha said of course, absolutely, anything we could do to help. And when she hung up, she looked at me with something that might have been respect and said, "Okay, that went better than I expected. Now we just need to figure out what we're going to say when we actually have to sit down with her." The problem was that we didn't have a story, not a complete one anyway, because we didn't know enough about the diamond's history before Jack to create a convincing narrative, and we couldn't just say that Jack had the diamond in his possession without explaining where he got it. And any explanation we gave would lead to more questions that we couldn't answer, without either lying to the police or admitting that Jack had been in possession of what was essentially stolen property. We spent the next week in a strange kind of limbo, watching the news obsessively as the story of the miracle diamond continued to capture public attention, and reading everything we could find online about diamond provenance and property law, and anything else that might give us an advantage. Samantha had postponed our meeting with Detective Chen, claiming that I wasn't feeling well and needed a few days to recover, which bought us some time but also made us look suspicious, like we were stalling or hiding something, which of course we were. During this time, something strange started happening between Samantha and me, which was that the enforced proximity and shared secret created a kind of unlikely alliance that neither of us had expected or particularly wanted, but that we both needed. She stopped making her usual cutting remarks and actually started treating me like a person instead of an inconvenience, and I found myself almost enjoying our strategy sessions, the way we'd sit at the kitchen table with laptops and notebooks spread out around us, working together toward a common goal like two generals planning a campaign. Daniel came home on a Friday afternoon, jet-lagged and exhausted from his trip, and Samantha and I had agreed that we would continue to keep the diamond secret from him until we had a better sense of whether we could actually claim it, because telling him now would only create stress and anger and wouldn't solve anything. I watched them embrace in the entryway, watched Samantha press her face into his shoulder and hold him tight, and I wondered if she was thinking about how she'd almost destroyed their comfortable life over her petty hatred of me, or if she was just relieved that he was home and still ignorant of what had happened. Daniel noticed the clean garage immediately, commenting on how good it looked and asking Samantha what had finally motivated her to tackle that project, and she gave him some story about finding a great junk removal company and wanting to surprise him, and he smiled and kissed her forehead and said she was amazing. And I felt sick watching this performance, but kept my mouth shut because I'd made a deal. But that night, lying in bed and thinking about everything that had happened, I realized that I'd made a terrible mistake in agreeing to keep quiet, because Daniel was my son, and he deserved to know what his wife had done, and more than that, he deserved to know that his mother had been living with a fortune for 15 years and had never told him because his father had made her promise to keep it secret. The guilt of keeping secrets from him, first Jack's secret and now this one, was starting to eat at me in a way that felt corrosive and wrong. And I found myself wondering if maybe the diamond was cursed after all. If maybe Jack had been right to warn me about it being dangerous, because it seemed like everyone who came into contact with it ended up lying and scheming and losing pieces of themselves in the process. I decided that I would give Samantha 2 more weeks to figure out a plan for claiming the diamond, and if she couldn't come up with something concrete by then, I was going to tell Daniel everything and let the chips fall where they may, because I was 65 years old and I'd spent too much of my life being quiet and accommodating, and I was done with that. The break in the case came from an unexpected direction, which was that Detective Chen called Samantha back and said that she'd been researching Jack's career and had found something interesting, which was that he'd been consulting for a private collector named Heinrich Volker, who died in a car accident in Cape Town 15 years ago, and that Volker's estate had never been fully cataloged because his death had been sudden and his family had been more interested in liquidating his assets than preserving his collection. Detective Chen said that according to her research, Volker had been known to acquire stones through unconventional means and that there had been rumors about a rare blue diamond in his possession. But nothing had ever been confirmed because he died before anyone could verify the stone's existence. This was exactly what we needed, a name and a connection and a plausible story that we could build on. And Samantha and I looked at each other across the kitchen table when she put the phone on speaker, and I could see the same mixture of relief and excitement in her eyes that I felt in my chest. Detective Chen said that she was going to reach out to Volker's family in South Africa to see if they had any information about the diamond or any documentation that might help establish ownership. And Samantha asked if we could be involved in that process since we had a personal connection through Jack. And the detective said she'd keep us informed, but that we needed to understand that if the diamond had been part of Volker's estate, it would legally belong to his heirs and not to anyone else, even if Jack had been in possession of it at the time of his death. This was the problem we'd been trying to avoid, the legal reality that possession didn't equal ownership, and that without documentation proving Jack had legitimately acquired the stone, we had no claim to it. But at least now, We had a direction to investigate and a story that made sense and didn't require us to invent details from nothing. Samantha thanked the detective and said we'd be happy to provide any additional information about Jack's work with Volker, and after she hung up, we spent the rest of the afternoon researching Heinrich Volker online, learning everything we could about the man whose death had set this entire chain of events in motion. What we found was both encouraging and deeply troubling, because Volker had apparently been a controversial figure in the diamond world, someone who'd made a fortune buying and selling stones of questionable provenance, and who'd had connections to several high-profile cases of diamond smuggling and theft. His death in 2010 had been investigated as potentially suspicious, with some people suggesting that he'd been murdered for his collection, but the investigation had been closed after the police determined it was just a tragic accident caused by brake failure on a mountain road. His family, a wife and 2 adult children, had sold off most of his known assets within 6 months of his death, but there had been persistent rumors that some of his most valuable pieces had never been found, that Volker had been paranoid about theft and had hidden his best stones in locations that only he knew about, and that he'd died without telling anyone where these hiding places were. The Azure Tear, I realized, was almost certainly one of these lost stones, something Volker had hidden so well that even his own family didn't know he had it, and Jack Heo continued been one of the few people Volker trusted enough to reveal its location to. This changed everything, because if Volker's family didn't know about the diamond and had never claimed it as part of his estate, then there was an argument to be made that Jack had acquired it legitimately, either as payment for services or as a gift from Volker before his death, and without documentation proving otherwise, we might actually have a case for ownership. Samantha was already thinking several steps ahead, talking about how we could present this to Detective Chen and what kind of evidence we'd need to support our claim, and I found myself getting caught up in her enthusiasm despite my better judgment. We decided that our next step would be to try to find people who'd known both Jack and Volker, colleagues or other gemologists who might remember interactions between them, and who could testify that there had been a professional relationship that could have included the transfer of valuable stones, and Samantha started making a list of names from Jack's old contacts and business cards that I'd kept in a box in my room. But then something happened that made us realize we weren't the only ones interested in the Azure Tear, and it started with a strange phone call that came to the house 3 days after our conversation with Detective Chen. I answered it because Samantha was in the shower, and Daniel was at work, and a man's voice with a thick accent that I couldn't quite place said, "Is this the residence of Marilyn Carter?" And when I confirmed that it was, he said, "I understand that your late husband Jack Carter had professional dealings with Heinrich Volker, and I'm calling to discuss a matter of mutual interest regarding a certain blue diamond that has recently come to public attention." My blood went cold, because this was exactly what Jack had warned me about. People who would come looking for the diamond. People who didn't send lawyers but sent something much worse, and I immediately said that I didn't know what he was talking about, and hung up, my hands shaking so badly that I dropped the phone twice before I managed to get it back on the receiver. Samantha came downstairs 10 minutes later to find me sitting on the couch, staring at nothing, and when I told her about the call, all the color drained from her face, and she said the words I'd been thinking but hadn't wanted to say out loud, which was that we were in over our heads and that we needed to either get help or walk away from the diamond entirely. We debated for hours about what to do, with Samantha arguing that we should tell Detective Chen about the threatening call, and me arguing that involving the police more deeply would only lead to more questions about how Jack had gotten the diamond and potentially put us in legal jeopardy, and we went back and forth until we were both exhausted and no closer to a decision. That night, I barely slept, jumping at every sound and convinced that someone was going to break into the house looking for information about the diamond. And when I finally did drift off around 4 in the morning, I had nightmares about Jack warning me that this would happen, that the diamond was cursed and that everyone who touched it would suffer. The man called back the next day, and this time Samantha answered, and she put him on speaker so I could hear, and his voice was polite but firm as he explained that he represented interests in South Africa, who had a legitimate claim to the Azure Tear, and who were prepared to offer us a substantial finder's fee if we could provide information about how the diamond had come into our possession. Samantha, thinking faster than I could, asked who these interests were and what kind of finder's fee they were talking about, and the man said that his clients wished to remain anonymous, but that they were prepared to offer $2 million in cash for information leading to the recovery of the diamond and an additional $3 million if we could help them establish a legal claim to it. $5 million just for information. And I could see the wheels turning in Samantha's head as she calculated what that kind of money would mean. But I shook my head violently, remembering Jack's warnings, and she finally told the man that we needed time to think about it and that we'd call him back at the number he provided. After she hung up, we had our first real fight since becoming reluctant partners, with Samantha arguing that $5 million was a fortune and that we were idiots if we didn't at least consider the offer, and me arguing that these people were dangerous and that taking their money would put us in their debt and probably put our lives at risk. Your husband has been dead for 15 years, Samantha said, her voice sharp with frustration. Whatever danger he was worried about is ancient history now, and besides, we don't even have the diamond anymore. It's sitting in police evidence, so what exactly can they do to us? But that was the problem, I tried to explain, because if these people were willing to offer $5 million just for information, that meant the diamond was worth far more than the $90 million the experts had estimated, which meant there were even more powerful interests at play than we'd realized, and getting involved with them in any capacity was dangerous no matter what they promised. We reached a compromise, which was that we would document everything about these calls and report them to Detective Chen as possible attempts to interfere with an ongoing investigation, which would both protect us legally and potentially give us leverage in establishing our own claim to the diamond. Samantha made the call the next morning, and Detective Chen sounded very interested in this new development, saying that she'd suspected there might be other parties interested in the diamond, but hadn't expected them to make contact so quickly or so directly. She asked us to forward any additional calls or messages to her immediately, and warned us not to engage with these people any further, because they might be attempting to build a case for fraud or theft against us if we provided them with information that could be used against us later. This was exactly what I'd been afraid of, that any action we took would somehow be twisted and used against us, and I started to wonder if maybe the best thing to do was just walk away from the diamond entirely, let it be auctioned off by the city, and go back to my quiet, invisible life, where at least I wasn't worried about mysterious phone calls from South African diamond dealers. But Samantha wasn't ready to give up, and she pointed out that if we walked away now, we'd be giving up not just the diamond, but also any chance of getting back at the people who'd hurt us. And she was right, even though I didn't want to admit it. The diamond represented more than just money to me now. It represented justice for Jack, who'd tried to protect me even after his death, and justice for myself, who'd spent too many years being treated like I didn't matter by people who should have loved me. So we doubled down on our research, spending every free moment trying to build a case for ownership. And Samantha even hired a private investigator to dig into Volker's background and see if there was any documentation that could support our claim. And I took out a second mortgage on my modest pension to help pay for it, because at this point, I was all in. Daniel noticed that something was going on between his wife and his mother, commenting on how we seemed to be spending a lot of time together and asking if everything was okay. And Samantha told him we'd been working on organizing family photos and documents, which was technically true if you considered research about dead diamond collectors to be family documents. 3 weeks after the diamond was found, Detective Chen called us in for a formal interview, saying that she had some new information and wanted to get our statement on record. We drove to the police station together, Samantha at the wheel and me in the passenger seat, and neither of us said much because we were both nervous about what the detective had discovered and whether it would help or hurt our case. Detective Chen turned out to be a serious woman in her 40s, with short black hair and intelligent eyes that seemed to see right through whatever story you were trying to tell. And she sat us down in a conference room with a recording device on the table and said, "I'm going to be direct with you both, because I think you know more about this diamond than you've been telling me, and I need to understand exactly what your connection to it is before this case gets any more complicated." I felt Samantha tense beside me, but she kept her composure and said that we'd been completely honest with the detective and that we were just trying to help solve the mystery of where the diamond came from. Detective Chen didn't look convinced, and she pulled out a folder full of documents and started laying them on the table one by one, each one a piece of a puzzle that I hadn't realized she was putting together. There were records of Jack's trips to South Africa, email exchanges between him and Volker that her office had recovered from old servers, photographs of them together at gem shows and conferences, and then, most damning of all, a customs declaration from 2010 showing that Jack had returned from Cape Town with a package declared as mineral samples for professional evaluation just 2 weeks before Volker's death. "So here's what I think happened," Detective Chen said, leaning back in her chair and watching our faces carefully. "I think Heinrich Volker knew he was in danger, either from business rivals or from people he'd crossed in the diamond trade, and I think he gave several of his most valuable stones to trusted associates for safekeeping, including your husband. And I think Jack Carter brought the Azure Tear back to the United States with the understanding that he would hold it until it was safe to return it to Volker or his family. But then Volker died, and Jack was stuck with a stone he couldn't sell or return without raising questions about how he'd gotten it." I felt tears starting to burn in my eyes because she'd gotten so close to the truth, close enough that I couldn't keep lying, close enough that I had to either tell her everything or watch her build a case that would make Jack look like a thief and me like his accomplice. So I took a deep breath and I told her the real story, starting with Jack's last conversation with me and his warning about the danger and his instructions to hide the diamond and never tell anyone. And I told her about the 15 years I'd spent keeping that secret and the weight of it, and how I'd almost been relieved when Samantha threw it away, because at least then I wouldn't have to carry it anymore. I told her about Jack's fear and his loyalty to Volker, and his belief that the diamond would bring nothing but trouble to anyone who tried to profit from it. And I told her that I'd never wanted the money, not really. I just wanted to honor my husband's last wish and keep the promise I'd made to him, even though it had cost me everything. Detective Chen listened to all of this without interrupting, her expression giving nothing away. And when I finally finished talking, she was quiet for a long moment before she said, "Mrs. Carter, I believe you, and I believe your husband was trying to do the right thing. But you need to understand that legally, this puts you in a very difficult position." She explained that by Jack's own admission through my testimony, the diamond belonged to Volker's estate, which meant it should have been returned to his family after his death, and by keeping it and hiding it, even with good intentions, I'd been in possession of property that wasn't mine. But she also said that she understood the extenuating circumstances and that she didn't believe I'd acted with criminal intent, and that if I was willing to cooperate fully with the investigation and help them contact Volker's family to see if they wanted to claim the diamond, she would recommend to the prosecutor's office that no charges be filed against me. It was more than I'd hoped for and less than I'd wanted, because it meant giving up any claim to the diamond, but also meant not going to jail. And after everything I'd been through, not going to jail seemed like a pretty good outcome. Samantha had been quiet through all of this, her face pale and her hands clenched in her lap. And after Detective Chen finished laying out the terms of my cooperation, she finally spoke up and said, "What about the fact that I threw the diamond away? Am I in trouble for that?" Detective Chen actually smiled, just slightly, and said, "Ms. Carter, Throwing away your mother-in-law's belongings, even if they turned out to be valuable, isn't a crime. It's just a really expensive mistake. And unless Mrs. Carter wants to press civil charges against you for destruction of property, which I'm guessing she doesn't, you're not in any legal jeopardy." Samantha looked at me, and I could see real fear in her eyes for the first time. Fear that I might actually follow through with charges just to punish her for years of cruelty. But I just shook my head because I was tired of fighting, and tired of being angry, and tired of letting this diamond destroy what was left of my family. Over the next month, Detective Chen worked with authorities in South Africa to contact Volker's family, and it turned out that his wife had died several years ago, but his 2 children, now in their 50s, were still alive and living in Johannesburg. They were shocked to learn about the diamond, saying they'd had no idea their father had possessed anything of such value, and they were grateful to Jack for keeping it safe even if he'd never been able to return it to them. There was talk of them pursuing legal action to claim the diamond, but their lawyer advised them that it would be expensive and time-consuming, and that the outcome wasn't guaranteed. And eventually they agreed to a settlement proposed by the city of Phoenix, which was that the diamond would be sold at auction and the proceeds would be split between Volker's estate, the city of Phoenix for holding and processing the diamond, Miguel Santos, the worker who found it, and me, as the widow of the man who'd preserved it for 15 years. The split wasn't equal, with Volker's children getting 50%, the city getting 20%, Santos getting 10%, and me getting 20%, which after taxes and legal fees would come out to about $12 million. But it was more money than I'd ever dreamed of having, and it was enough to change my life completely. The auction happened on a crisp November morning at a prestigious auction house in New York, and I flew out with Daniel and Samantha to watch it happen, because after everything this diamond had put me through, I wanted to see it sold with my own eyes. The Azure Tear was the star of the auction, marketed as the miracle diamond, with an incredible story of loss and recovery. And collectors from around the world called in their bids while we watched on monitors in a private room. The bidding started at $40 million and climbed quickly to $70 million, then $80, then $90. And I held my breath as it crossed the $100 million mark, because I'd never imagined it would sell for more than the original estimates. When the hammer finally came down at $135 million, I actually laughed, because all of Jack's warnings about danger and all of my years of hiding and all of Samantha's spite had led to this moment where a stone no bigger than my thumbnail sold for more money than most people would see in 1,000 lifetimes. Daniel found out about the diamond on the flight to New York because I finally told him everything, and I watched his face go through shock and anger and confusion and finally something like understanding as he processed the fact that his mother had been living with a fortune all these years and had never said a word. He was angry at first, asking why I'd never trusted him with the truth, and I tried to explain about Jack's warning and my promise and my fear of what would happen if the wrong people found out. But he didn't really understand until I told him about the mysterious phone calls and the South African interests who'd offered me $5 million for information. Then he got quiet, and he held my hand on the armrest between our seats, and he said, "I'm sorry, Mom. I'm sorry I wasn't there for you. I'm sorry I let Samantha treat you the way she did. I'm sorry I was so wrapped up in work that I didn't see what was happening in my own house." It was the conversation we should have had years ago, the one that might have prevented all of this pain if we'd just been honest with each other from the start. Samantha sat across the aisle from us, looking out the window at the clouds, and I could see her reflection in the glass, and she looked smaller somehow, diminished by the knowledge of what she'd almost cost us and what she'd revealed about herself in the process. She apologized to me formally the night before the auction, a real apology without excuses or justifications, and she said that she'd spent the last month in therapy trying to understand why she'd been so cruel to me, and that she was working on becoming a better person. I told her I appreciated the apology and that I hoped she meant it, but that it would take time for me to trust her again, and she nodded and said she understood. Daniel told me later that he'd given her an ultimatum, that she needed to change or he was going to leave her, and I was proud of him for finally standing up for me, even if it had taken a $135 million diamond to make it happen. With my share of the auction proceeds, $12 million after all the fees and taxes, I bought myself a small house in Sedona with a view of the Red Rocks, and I set up a foundation in Jack's name to provide scholarships for students studying gemology and geology, because I wanted something good to come out of all this pain and secrecy. I also gave a substantial donation to the Maricopa County Recycling Center in honor of Miguel Santos, the worker whose honesty had set this entire chain of events in motion, and I started volunteering there once a week, sorting through other people's discarded belongings and thinking about how we never really know what's valuable until we're forced to see it clearly. Daniel and Samantha visit me once a month, and our relationship is different now. More honest and more careful, like we're all walking on new ground and aren't quite sure if it will hold our weight. Sometimes I think about Jack and wonder if he knew how this would all turn out, if he somehow understood that the diamond wasn't just a stone, but a test, a way of revealing who people really were when faced with unimaginable wealth and impossible choices. I think he would have been proud of me for keeping my promise as long as I could, and for finally having the courage to tell the truth when the time came, and for surviving the whole ordeal with my dignity mostly intact. The Azure Tear is gone now, sitting in some wealthy collector's vault somewhere, no longer my burden to carry or my secret to keep, and I'm finally free of the weight that I've carried for 15 years. But I learned something important through all of this, which is that the real treasure was never the diamond at all. It was the strength I found in myself when I was finally pushed too far, and the relationship I rebuilt with my son, and the knowledge that I deserved better than I'd been accepting. And those things are worth more than any stone, no matter how rare or how blue or how valuable. And as for Samantha, she's still married to Daniel, still trying to become the person she claims she wants to be. And I'm watching her with cautious hope, because people can change if they really want to. And maybe she really does want to. The diamond brought out the worst in both of us, her cruelty and my passivity, but it also gave us a chance to become something better, to learn from our mistakes and grow beyond them, and that's its own kind of miracle. Every morning, I wake up in my house in Sedona, looking out at the red rocks glowing in the sunrise, and I think about how close I came to losing everything, and how a single act of spite led to a discovery that changed my life, and how sometimes the things we think will destroy us actually set us free. The Azure Tear is gone, but I'm still here, and I'm finally living the life that Jack wanted for me all along, free from fear and full of possibilities, and that's worth more than all the diamonds in all the mines in all the world.